Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this conference, Independence and After, Dr. Eric Williams and the Making of Trinidad and Tobago. My name is Ewan Morgan. I'm a Professor of US Studies and Deputy Director at the Institute for the Study of the Americas. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today for this very interesting conference. You're sitting in the Senate room of the University of London, it's a rather grand room, where until fairly recently the Senate of the University of London met, and the heads of all the colleges would be sitting where you're sitting, and the Vice Chancellor of the University of London would be up here. I'm not sure how interesting those sessions were, but I'm sure today's session will be extremely engaging by comparison. We're very grateful in the Institute for the Study of the Americas to the Eric Williams Memorial Collection, whose generous financial assistance has made this event possible. In the Institute for the Study of the Americas, we have a brief to facilitate research on the study of all the different regional elements of the Americas, Canada, the United States, Latin America and the Caribbean. And we also have a hemispheric brief to examine the entire the Americas in their entirety. This event today is part of our very important Caribbean program, and I'd like to say a huge thanks to Kate Quinn, who's been very active in working to set up this important event. I wish you well for the conference, and I'll now hand over to Kate, who will conduct the first real bit of business.
Thank you, Ian. I just want to add my welcome on behalf of the Institute for the Study of the Americas. My name is Kate Quinn, and I'm a lecturer in Caribbean History here at the Institute, and I head up the Caribbean program here, the Teaching and Events program. I also want to add my thanks to Erica Williams-Connell of the Eric Williams Memorial Collection, without whose funding of this event we couldn't have had such an exciting array of speakers, and also to thank my own institute for their funding of this event. I'd like to draw your attention also to a small exhibition which David Clover, our librarian from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, has put up, which you will see as you're leaving, going left out of here, before you hit the main double doors of the staircase. There's a glass cabinet, and that contains a display of materials from our library on the making of Trinidad and Tobago. So the first edition of Capitalism and Slavery, P&M manifestos, and so on. So do take a look at that during your time at this conference. On lunch arrangements, I know that Eric Williams believed in free education, so this event is free, but I don't know if he believed in a free lunch, so I have to say that the lunch is for speakers and chairs only, and that, but there is a cafe downstairs in the south block on the ground floor. There's also cafes around the area, so do take advantage of that and come back on time for the after lunch session. And we're very sorry to say that Rafiq Shah, who was down to speak today, has had to withdraw from the conference for family reasons, illness in the family. We wish him well. And he has sent us his paper in advance, so this paper will be made available. We will put his paper up online so that you'll all be able to access that after today. But now I'd like to welcome our first panel, and we have a very packed schedule, so I'm going to be quite strict on time. Can I invite Colin to join us up here on this very grand stage? Our first panel is Dissecting the Man and the Myth, and our speakers are Paul Sutton, Selwyn and Colin Palmer.
Right, welcome everyone. I've recently retired from full-time and part-time university life. I began my career working on Trinidad and Tobago, and my first book was a book I worked with Eric Williams, and so I think it's possibly fitting as well that Eric Williams is part of my retirement plan as I ease myself into pruning roses and whatever else you're supposed to do at this time of life. A couple of years ago, Umberto Garcia Munoz was sitting over there and director of the Institute for Caribbean Studies in Puerto Rico, said, "Paul, you're exactly the person to review this massive book on Eric Williams that Selwyn Ryan has written." So I said, "Thanks, yes, I'd very much like to do that." So I carted the book back and started to looking at it. And as I did, I realised the immense amount of work went into it. So I said to Umberto, "I can't do an ordinary 1,000-word review. I'm going to have to do something more substantive because the book demands a more substantive approach. Not only because of the work in it, because also of the person of Eric Williams." And so I wrote a review essay, or rather, I've just finished writing a review essay. Umberto's been waiting for it for 2 years. It's here, Umberto, you can take it away with you. But it's done. And in fact, I had to organise the conference with Kate, or help Kate, in part to make me do the review. So that's the history of that. Right, what I want to do today is bring out some of the points which I've made in this review of this book. I've also given a copy of it last night to Selwyn, so Selwyn's had a chance to read it, and I'm sure he will respond to some of my criticisms and praises, and we'll also see what Colin has to say about it as well. First point I wanted to make, and I make in the review, is that Eric Williams has a record unmatched in the rest of the Caribbean, and that's because I think he was a scholar, a statesman, and a politician, all three mixed together. And there are others who can move on in that way, but it is for the Commonwealth Caribbean. I would never want to put Fidel Castro out of the picture, but for the Commonwealth Caribbean, it is indeed a remarkable record. The book that Selwyn has so far produced is one of now a very large scholarship on Eric Williams. And I think that the interest that there is in the man, by far I think more than there are in any other comparable Commonwealth Caribbean leaders, tells us again about his stature and his role in the region. My review, as I've set it out here, is in 3 parts of the book. The first sets out the structure and content, and I want to briefly go through some of those bits because I want to isolate what Selwyn thinks about Eric Williams and whether I agree with him or not. The second part looks at the personality of Eric Williams and how far that coloured and shaped the particular approach to Trinidad politics. And the final part situates Selwyn's book within the general structure or scholarship of Trinidad and Tobago during the Williams years. So starting off with structure and content. The early parts of the book, needless to say, are about Eric Williams' early years. Eric Williams, of course, has written famously an autobiography of that. And as I make the point in the book, Eric Williams and Barack Obama are both in the same person, share in common the fact that they released autobiographies, more or less, before they actually went into politics. And that tells us something, does it not, about the ego of the man, or at least how they thought of themselves. In the account by Selwyn, I think the most important point I found in the early chapter was Selwyn's insistence on identifying Eric Williams as a black French Creole. And most accounts do not mention that black French Creole aspect to Eric Williams' background. And of course, Eric Williams famously, in the period just before independence, declared war on the white French Creoles and various others who were opposed to the independence movement. And Ryan specifically makes a point about how you can link those two, because in his early years, it seems that the Williams family, when Williams was growing up as a boy, were ignored by his French white Creole ancestry. So Ryan speculates, quote, here perhaps on a speech Williams made, must have they done, condemning the French white Creoles amongst others. Here perhaps is a smoking gun that links William's status as a frustrated black French Creole to his political and social war against the white French Creoles who had refused to treat him and his immediate family as part of the kin. And I draw attention to that quote simply because, of course, Eric Williams is famously said to have borne grudges against people all his life. And who knows, and where was he bearing grudges, and at what period did these grudges begin? The other part which Selwyn makes in his early point is a review of the scholarship on Eric Williams, a review of the reviews, essentially. I'm not going to go into that because there's been an Oxford conference discussing history, but I think Selwyn is right to observe, and I've written about it as well in my work on Eric Williams, to observe that the early work was much better than the later work if we're dealing with history. And that eventually Eric Williams, I quote Selwyn Ryan again, sought to occupy two stools, the intellectual and the political, and in the end found himself caught between them. Why the two stools? He was using history to try and inform politics. And when he was using history to inform politics in the way he did, I think the rigour went out of the history and the politics came more to the fore. That's my judgment, and I'm interested to see if Selwyn thinks very much the same. Going on to the next part of the book, a good parts 2, 3 and 4 of the book, in a way we've seen before. Selwyn published one of the first books on Trinidad's politics called Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago in 1972, and he makes the point in the early part of the book that he was often asked to bring out a new edition but didn't do so because he wanted to revise it. And here in Eric Williams' this new one, we have the revisions and the updatings, as far as I can see, that would have been made to the earlier work. So some of the chapters, when you read them, you can find them in Race and Nationalism, and others you can find they've been substantially adapted or worked on or new material added. Some of that new material is a result of books which were not available in 1972 but were published in the late 70s from Winston Mahabir onwards, books and reminiscences of ministers who worked with Eric Williams. We have Mahabir's work, Solomon's work, Granado's work, Ghani's biography of Kalamuni Muhammad, which Muhammad was involved in, and others. And what we do then find is a certain richness to the account in this book, which we don't find in another book. And of course what we also see is contradiction. Because of course Eric Williams was a very difficult person to understand, the myth and the man. And I'll come to that at the end. And of course in these accounts, as Selwyn presents them, as well you can see that even those who worked closely with him found sometimes it difficult to understand what he was at, even when they're describing the same event for which they were essentially involved. What I found interesting also in this are a couple of points though. One is that when Eric Williams was really confronted with opposition, he was prepared to move back. And there are 3 examples here. The 1956 elections, the results of that, where he was prepared to compromise with the British government being involved. That, of course, was to take power. The dispute over Chagaramas, which was a dispute which brought him into conflict with the United States. And also a dispute with the Catholic Church, which was also very important in educational issues. These were all before independence. And we see in these instances, as Selwyn sets them out, an ability, the willingness of Eric Williams to, in inverted commas, beat strategic retreats in order to accommodate the interests of others. What prompted these compromises? Necessity, grudgingly given by Eric Williams, or the greater good? which often is a sign of statesmanship. And what I find interesting from this, and it comes back to my point I made about some of the other writers who've written on Eric Williams, is that from the accounts that Selwyn presents, or they present, you can construct a case for both. A group statesmanship, but you can also construct a case for Williams basically grudgingly giving way. The same, what about the next point, is Williams' domination. Much has been written about Williams as a charismatic figure, beginning with the work of Emeritus, black intellectuals come to power. And there is undoubtedly that, and I'll come on to that at the moment. But what, or exactly how, did Eric Williams dominate those around him? And what you find in both this account, The Myth and the Man, and what you find in Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago, is an undoubted dominance by Eric Williams, both of the party programme, of the political party, the People's National Movement, that he formed. Although, and I'd be interested in Selwyn's comment here, I think in the later revisions, that dominance, to me, seemed more acute, appearing more early than it was in the book as he has it here. But of course, domination is a strange thing. You can dominate by fear. And there is no doubt, as Selwyn Ryan puts it, that William could create a climate of fear and distrust among his colleagues if it suited his purposes. But of course, Eric Williams also dominated by consent and by authority. And the notion of charismatic power, of course, requires consent and authority. So, exactly how and why Eric Williams dominated is an interesting point. And my view is, and I come back to that again later as well, that it's not a force of personality we have here, but rather Eric Williams' domination must be understood as a sociological phenomenon, independent of his own will and conditioned by the actions of those around him and the situation in which he found himself. In other words, it's not the independent action, an independent variable that we're dealing with here, but a sociological context which needs to be examined if we're to account more closely for his leadership. Selwyn then goes on to discuss a whole raft of issues in the book. Indeed, one of the interesting things, of course, is that it's not just a biography of Eric Williams, it's also, in many ways, a political history of Trinidad and Tobago in those years. What do we learn from these chapters? On economic policy, the message is fairly clear. Ryan argues that Williams was, unquote, a pragmatist, not a socialist, unquote, informed by a wider vision of establishing in Trinidad and Tobago, quote, capitalism with a human face. Unquote. In respect of opposition to him, Eric Williams could be manipulative, calculating, and particularly an approach of co-opting others. We see that in a number of instances, but the one I want to highlight is the Black Power events of 1970, where after the events, Eric Williams took over much of the programme, or some of the programme, that the Black Power activists had stated in the streets, and redefined, or sought to try and redefine it in a new statement of the aims and objectives of the People's National Party. But that didn't last for long, because in 1973, Eric Williams suddenly offered his resignation. Why? Ryan believes it was genuine, and I've written elsewhere, so do I. Ryan believes it was genuine because, quote, Williams, and I quote him here, was a profoundly depressed and disillusioned man, overwhelmed by a sense of heroic failure and under severe pressure from his beloved daughter, unquote. He changed his mind when, overnight, the price of oil tripled, quote, providing a life raft by which he could return. Yes, I think that is the case. But it's interesting still to speculate why he chose to go in 1973. Was it so he could smoke them out, which is a sort of famous phrase used in Trinidad at the time for the opposition, or was he really genuinely concerned to go? I get it from this book that he was genuinely concerned to go, but again, I'd like Selwyn's point on that one. A number of other chapters then follow on various aspects of Eric Williams' political authority and how he used it. From one of my favourite chapters, and I think it reflects the work that Selwyn has done over the years on public administration and the public sector in Trinidad. Indeed, he once headed a body, a public utilities body in Trinidad, the Commission on this. And it's an excellent chapter he writes here on Eric Williams' relationship with his senior civil servants, which is absolutely key because in many ways Trinidad's politics was the politics of the senior civil servants, a few ministers, and Eric Williams. As Selwyn observes, almost every senior public service and minister ended up as a casualty of Eric Williams. Indeed, that went to the highest. Doddridge Lane, who was the permanent secretary and the head of the public service, was disgraced in inverted commas, or shall we say, sent off, as they famously say in the UK, on garden leave, when at one point when he was at the height of his powers by Eric Williams. Why? Ryan notes that Williams had, quote, a seemingly incurable weakness for believing much of what he was told and acted upon it in a paranoid way, unquote. He also says about this and other episodes, quote, Williams was acting irrationally as a result of the psychiatric condition from which he was said to be suffering, unquote. Come back onto that. And quote again, Williams was an insecure, suggestible, paranoid, suspicious, and emotionally unstable individual who had great difficulty handling human relations, unquote. And these are all pretty damning statements about Eric Williams as a person. And maybe, again, we can share some views about whether they are correct statements or not. Well, what I think Selwyn in this chapter, and indeed other chapters preceding it, shows, and I quote again, whatever talents Williams had, and he had many, managerial capacity was clearly not one of them, unquote. And of course it's extremely difficult to disagree with that as one wade your way through this particular book. The final section, morality in public affairs. When the PNM came to power, morality in public affairs was their key slogan in 1956. Get rid of the corruption for which Trinidad is famous. When Eric Williams died in 1981, corruption was equally a key issue. Why? Why hadn't it been dealt with? The evidence of corruption in Trinidad and Tobago, as indeed in much of the Commonwealth Caribbean, is equivocal in many cases and compelling in just a few. But it's obviously very clear in the case of one person, O'Halloran, John O'Halloran, one of Eric Williams' ministers, and a man who Ryan describes as, I quote, clearly the most powerful political personality in the regime apart from Williams himself, unquote. So therefore, Eric Williams number two. Now, if he was very clearly involved in corruption, did Eric Williams know? Did Eric Williams want to know? Did O'Halloran have something on Eric Williams? Who knows? But clearly he indulged in some way or the other that sort of corruption. When you indulge it at the number two level, it's not far and very quickly it will descend downwards. So why and what was Eric Williams about in corruption? On Williams himself, Ryan concludes, we have, I quote, we have no justiciable evidence that convicts Williams or proves that he ever asked for or received a bribe, unquote. Note the use of the word justiciable. It suggests Ryan believes Williams would not be found guilty in a court of law, but against the less exacting standards of public opinion, and possibly even history, the case is more open, though I believe one in which Williams would ultimately be clear. On personality. Williams is famously reported in a US magazine in 1971 saying, I'm the one who has power here. When I say come, you come, and when I say go, you go. That's true. But then he held about 8 ministries at that time. So that was only the truth of the matter. And very shortly afterwards, in the 1971 election, he gave them all up and became just Prime Minister. So did he really enjoy power? How did he do it? Yes, he enjoyed power in one way, but then, as Ryan says, he never interfered in judicial decisions. He allowed a free and critical press. He tolerated dissent, but not disorder in the streets. And he refused in his last days to name a successor. In other words, Williams allowed opposition and dissent, maybe encouraged it in some ways, or at least encouraged the circumstances in which it was around. So therefore, how much was he an autocrat and how much was he a democrat? The balance, I think, is less autocracy, or at the best, soft autocracy. Williams, it was said in 1981, died suddenly, unexpectedly, of basically an undiagnosed diabetic coma in a condition bordering on neglect. That raised speculations about altruistic suicide. Let me just make 3 points about that. I notice I'm being told time, but I think these are useful points to make. In 1980, I worked with Eric Williams on a book of his accepted speeches and writings. I saw Williams on 3 occasions at Easter in that year, 1980. I can attest that in the privacy of his own home, he appeared to be neglectful of his person and most probably reclusive. But he was intellectually very capable, and he was very commanding in the presence of those ministers who attended these meetings. He was also intellectually very sharp and criticised me for not keeping up my reading with the latest debates on slavery. So therefore, he's intellectually sound. But I sensed a person who was, shall we say, not taking the best care of himself. I think that Ryan has reached a defensible conclusion in his statement that, quote, a depressed Williams became suicidal and chose to let nature take its course. That raises, again, questions about Eric Williams. I think, again, I'd like to know whether, in fact, we can move to that, whether that is a definitive statement. Lastly, a couple of very small points on where we fit the work. There are, I think, 3 questions, finally, which the work raises, which I think we need to do if we're going to really understand Eric Williams. One is the what-if question. In his autobiography, Williams makes much of the fact that he didn't obtain a fellowship at All Souls College in Oxford. What if he had done so? When he was dismissed from the Caribbean Commission, it was because he didn't get promotion within it in 1955. What if he had? We don't know, because we still haven't got deep published accounts of his Oxford years or his years in the Caribbean Commission. Was Eric Williams anticipating going into politics, or was Eric Williams sucked into politics? Was, in other words, politics for Eric Williams a second best if other opportunities had occurred? Second, understanding Eric Williams. Eric Williams was among many in the intellectual debates and decolonisation movements. I compared him to Nero and to Walter Rodney. Tony Mango has compared him to Juan Bosch. Selwyn has compared him very briefly in a few pages to Lee Kuan Yew. I think more of this work needs to be done. I think more of this comparative work would allow us to define whether Eric Williams was a unique person, and in what ways he was a unique person, and otherwise to what way he was simply another nationalist politician but operating in the context of Trinidad Tobago. And lastly, Selwyn has done a brilliant job in bringing together all the published work and also reminiscences of people, and as he's spoken over the years, and put it in this book. What he has not done is enter the archives of the PNM or enter the archives of the Trinidad government to know who made the decision, when, what, how, why. Those issues are still issues that we need to discuss and work on. And until someone does go into those archives, and it may be a very difficult job, and who knows, the ants may have eaten half of them, and the others might have been distributed about. But anyway, until we go into those, we are still working on people's views rather than on the hard evidence that this was the issue, that was the issue. It's either discussed or not discussed together. And we will only in that way know what Eric Williams has done. Finally, I've called this an appreciation and critique. I've not done as much appreciation as I wanted because Madam Chair has been very insistent, not as much critique as I wanted. But I want to end on the appreciation. I think it's a massive piece of work, a very good piece of work, and it's the beginning, the first book that anyone needs to read if they're going to make a serious study of Eric Williams and of politics in Trinidad and Tobago during this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. I must say I made a great omission earlier in my thanks. I should have thanked Paul Sutton, who organised the conference with me, so apologies, Paul, for leaving you out. And we should also welcome His Excellency Carmen Nichols from the High Commission of Trinidad and Tobago, and Rowana Oval also from the High Commission. So welcome. I will ask Professor Selwyn Ryan to come and give his response.
Good morning. I want to begin by thanking Kate and her associates for giving me an excuse to come to London and to do some other things that are associated with my visits here. Before yesterday evening, I had no idea what Paul was going to say. The book had been reviewed before by my colleagues in Jamaica and elsewhere, Brian Meeks, Neville Duncan, Richard Brereton, Anna Ramprasad, who was here with us, very glowingly, and I wondered whether Paul was going to be in that lineup or whether he was going to be critical. I was particularly concerned that he might inadvertently raise an issue which I wanted to avoid in this context, and that is the question of Dr. Williams' health. I got the review last night, and I was very relieved that the book, while not uniformly glowing, was mostly so, and that I need not have bothered. And I thank you, Paul, for being fair, just, balanced. The review is almost as good as the book. The problem was now, what was I going to say by way of response, since I did not have to defend the book? And I thought that what I would do, and I made some notes late last night or early this morning, I would say something, at first at any rate, about the context in which the book was conceived and written. And in a curious way, I thought, this book really tells of my relations with Eric Williams. Williams, of course, wrote my relations with the Caribbean Commission. But this book has a history. I only met Dr. Williams on 4 occasions. Once, when he sent for me, I was then doing research in Ghana, and he sent the ambassador to the OAU to find me. He wanted me to come back and join his constitutional reform exercise. So he pulled me out of Africa, so to speak, and plunked me down in the middle of the events of 1970 and the Constitution Commission, which he appointed to revise the Constitution. Then I saw him again when we presented the report of that commission in 1974, and I saw a dimension of him that I did not, up to that time, did not understand, and it was the way in which he could deal with people. And he dealt with the Chief Justice, the former Chief Justice, Hugh Wooding, in such a manner that I found it very chilling. But I'll talk about that later on. I then met him at a function having to do with public utilities. Again, he searched out for me, and I'll try to explain why. In 1977 or thereabouts, he had been trying to reach me through back channels to come into the cabinet, and I, of course, was not interested at all. But he eventually persuaded me to give up what I was planning to do, which was to go back to East Africa, to serve as chairman of the Public Utilities Commission, which gave me, in a way, responsibility over all the 7 utilities that we had at the time: water, telephones, electricity, etc., which were which he was attempting to restructure in keeping with other things that he had in mind. And then there was a fourth time when he invited me to the house, and I sat with him and a number of technocrats, and I never really saw people's knuckles grow so white with fear. These were big men in the system. We were discussing something to do with tea and tech, and I wondered, what am I doing here? But again, it gave me a perspective on Williams, which I don't think many academics, or maybe others, had. And in a way, I feel that, let me back up a little bit. My relation with Eric Williams really goes back to 1976, 56, when I was a young student getting ready to go to the University of Toronto. My father was in class with Eric Williams, and he used to talk about Eric Williams. And I followed every meeting that Williams gave. I got on my Rudge bicycle, and I followed, like many others, to listen to Williams. And in a fundamental way, my aspirations, my vocational aspirations, and my academic ambitions were shaped by some of the things which Williams talked about in Woodford Square. Locke and Burke and all these people I knew of before I left these shores to go abroad, and that was in fact the contribution which Williams made to my education and my adult growth. So when I talk about Williams, bear in mind that there is a very fundamental way in which I see him as my model, my hero, and something went wrong, and that is reflected in the book. I did not start, in a way, being negative or being hypercritical. The book has a history. Parts of it are very, very positive. I endorse Williams, I understand. And it's only as I got into the meat of the book, so to speak, and reflect on certain things that I saw happening around me, that I began to ask questions. What kind of man is this? So that's by way of background. Then in addition to my involvement in the Public Utilities Commission and various constitutional reform exercises, I have been writing a column as I think, Paul and I go back and forth with. When up and down the Caribbean writing things, Paul and I tend to forget these days. Paul and Tony Payne. We have written many things together. So I was very curious to know what Paul was going to say, because we have a basic understanding. I consider Paul and Tony Caribbean intellectuals. They are not really English fellows. So anyway, yes, I was saying that in addition to the formal positions to which Williams appointed me, for 30-something years I wrote a Sunday column. Invariably that column would be very critical of Williams. But he never moved to censure me or to make life difficult for me in any way. In fact, his strategy was to attempt to buy me out, to bring me into the system. And in many respects, some of the things that I say in the book reflect the kinds of preoccupations which I had in writing the columns. How many minutes you giving me? 7 minutes. Oh dear. Okay. There are some chapters that if you plan to buy the book, well, you read the whole book. But if you don't, there are a number of chapters that I wanted to draw your attention because they gave me a lot of concern, anxiety. One of them had to do with his treatment of people who worked very closely with him. Many of those people I knew very well. Many of them I went to school with in Canada. Many of them we played cards together. People like Doddridge Allen, people like Eugenio Moore, etc. And I could not explain why these men who had served Williams, who had given up their Christmases, their New Year's Eve, their wives, to work for Eric Williams under the most demanding circumstances, should be treated in this way. All of them, except possibly Frank Bassotti, I'm not sure. All of them, Paul has indicated, ended up being in what we call cold storage. Doddridge Allen, J. O'Neill Lewis, Eugenio Moore, with Bunny Palmer, a whole bunch of them who were destroyed physically, not in the sense of being shot or anything like that, but in terms of their lives and their families. And I had to find explanations for this. So I really started to ask questions. And I interviewed all of these people whom I knew very well intimately. And I think I understated certain things because certain people were still alive, and I had to deal with it in a very delicate way. But I am quite convinced that some of the things that I say in the book about Williams' psychiatric condition are, there's an evidential basis for what I say. I try to be discreet about it because of certain other kinds of considerations which will emerge later down the road. But I'm convinced. I interviewed about 30 or 40 people who either medical doctors, psychiatrists, etc., before I decided that I would go with that particular story. And time will tell whether I made an error, a very serious error, or whether or not I was on the button. So that issue, some of those issues are discussed in the chapter on Williams's mandarins. I also had a lot of difficulty with the chapter on corruption. Again, for all kinds of reasons, which we could talk about later on, I wanted to be very, very careful about statements made. I think I was careful in terms of what I said, conclusions which I drew, but I ended up by saying, while we have, as Paul has said, no justiciable evidence about involvement, if you connect the dots, you have to come to some conclusions. I came to mind, but I am not going to say much more about that at this particular point in time. Paul raised the question about the black French creoles. Actually, one had heard this point made before, that Williams had a chip on his shoulder or two chips on two shoulders. I don't know which one is more accurate. But the person who did the work on Williams as Black French Creole was in fact Jerry Bessel, who has written a book which I recommend. There are some questions that one has to ask, but the book deals in great detail with Williams' family, the white side and the black side, etc. And I thought it very fascinating. And I mention it because I think it has some explanatory power. How much remains to be seen. But again, I can't pursue that matter now. As an aside, in the book, you see reference to Williams's father taking him up the hill to Laventille to be, quote unquote, dealt with by an over woman. And Williams himself talks about it. He said his father used to drag him and his brother up the hill for their weekly rendezvous with this Obeah woman from St. Vincent. And he talks about how his mother reacted very negatively to these things that Williams' father was bringing into the house. Jerry Bessel has just written a book about the Govee, the voice from the Govee, and he builds on it. But apparently, Williams' mother was very upset, very angry, very concerned that her children were being taken up there, and not only her children, but her chickens. Whether that has anything to do with Williams' political behavior later on, I have no idea, but I thought it was an interesting story. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is to not make it a heavy political science thing, every sentence, punctuated by a footnote, etc. I wanted to write something that people would enjoy and learn. And I thought of people down the road reading the book. And so the book has a style, I think. It has I try to get people to laugh at times in the book, particularly in the introduction, which is hilarious, I think. Paul has asked me a lot of questions, which I would love to answer, but try to answer. But one or two I came to the conclusion somewhere down the road that what David Owen said in his book, In Sickness and in Power, that a lot of what is said in that book applies not only to Dr. Williams, but many of our Caribbean political leaders. That you never quite understand a lot of things unless you know what is going on in the throne room and who is in the throne room. And as you read the book, I think you should be aware that I am influenced by that book, not because I had read it, because I had read about these things in graduate school, but I felt that so much of what Owen said applied not only to William and to Burnham and to Gary and now to Golding, who I understand has resigned, and Manning, who has been displaced. So there is an element in which I enjoyed looking at some of these theories and opinions and trying to see whether they were relevant to our condition, the condition of leadership in the Caribbean. Paul raised some questions about omissions that I omitted to consult or to give due attention to other academic work, Laguerre, Scott McDonald, Selwyn Kojo, Colin Palmer. I read all these books and I enjoyed them. I just felt that given the kind of book I was trying to write, there was really no need for me to seek other sources. Well, that's putting it badly. That I felt that I really, in many cases, was the authority because I was in there as an academic. There are many academics who were there as academics. There are many who were there as outsiders. I thought that what I had, what none of them had, was a presence in both spheres. Because I was president of chairman of the Public Utilities Commission for 7 years inside that thing. And Paul is not correct when he said there was nobody inside there looking on at what was happening. I saw all of these people and what they were doing and I said that I would really tear up all the books, all the lectures that I had written before going into politics. I wanted to tear them up because they were not relevant. We had a notion as academics of what was taking place. We had no idea what was really taking place. And I thought that my lectures, as good as they were, did not do justice to the complexity that I saw in evidence in my 7 years there. Let me stop there then, and we can pick up on some of these questions. But I read the book. I don't know if there are any left. We printed 2 sets. It's heavy. And had I known how difficult it would be to read when a book that is as heavy as that, if it falls on your nose, you're in serious trouble. But I think at the end of the day, you will deem it worthwhile. And I don't get many royalties, but any contribution would be welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, we're very fortunate to have all these formidable scholars of Williams on the panel this morning, and here is another one of them who's written another excellent book on Williams, Professor Colin Palmer.
Thank you very much. 2 disclaimers. I've never met Eric Eustace Williams. In fact, I saw him once in my life when I was an undergraduate. And secondly, unlike Selwyn, I did not write my book for you to enjoy. It's a prescription for insomnia. For those of you who have not yet read it, if you're having problems falling asleep,
It's a good book.
it's something you might wish to have by your bedside. It is not a biography of Eric Williams, and it doesn't deal with the murky politics, domestic politics of Trinidad and Tobago. It addresses Williams' role on on a larger Caribbean stage. Of course, there's always a dialectic relationship between the domestic and the external. I think I was invited to provide comic relief because when I got on the program, a few maybe days ago perhaps, Kate asked me to discuss how I came to write the book that I wrote. I believe she may have asked Selwyn to do the same thing, as she said. But I'm going to do that, and I'm going to quickly address some of the issues raised by Paul Sutton, although I just heard the paper. My interest in Eric Williams, the scholar and the statesman, really began in the early 1990s. I was then the chairman of the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The university press, the UNC press that is, had decided to publish a new edition of Capitalism and Slavery, a book that it had published in 1944. The new edition would appear in 1994, the occasion of the 50th anniversary of its first publication. One of the editors of the press invited me to write an introduction to the book, a task for which I was wholly unprepared intellectually. The press had previously published a book that Franklin Knight and I had edited. And this book, the Modern Caribbean, remains in print, rather surprisingly. The press may have thought that my role in the preparation of this volume gave me the credentials to write the introduction to the new edition of Capitalism and Slavery. I was more impressed, however, by the $300 or $400 that the press was offering me. I took the task rather seriously, did some research, and many of you, I believe, have read the resulting piece. Erica Williams, Williams' daughter, read it and liked it. I was surprised, however, that when I was invited to give the keynote address at a week-long conference to be held in Port of Spain in 1994, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the publication of Capitalism and Slavery, and also examining Williams's corpus of scholarly works, and of course his career in politics. I had no idea what I was getting into. I did not know that the conference would attract scholars from across the world, students, local politicians, and especially members of the PNM, Williams's former colleagues, the press, and so on. Selwyn Carrington, one of the principal organizers of the conference, reminded me a few days ago that it was that conference that spawned the contemporary scholarly interest in Eric Williams, and Selwyn is sitting right there. But we did not realize...
We were the one that invited you, Erica.
Ah, there you go.
And we invited you as a West Indian scholar.
Uh-huh.
I'm not as a speaker here.
All right. But I came, but as I said, I didn't know what I was getting into. But we didn't realize the significance then of the conference. Most certainly, I did not. Once again, I took the assignment rather seriously. But I found that the written work on Williams up to that point was rather thin, except, of course, for reviews of Capitalism and Slavery. Somehow I was able to write the speech and arrived at St. Augustine the morning in question to deliver it. Quite frankly, I was astonished when I saw the size of the crowd, the TV cameras, and the various dignitaries in the audience, including President Robinson and others. My prepared text included what I thought was a balanced account of Eric Williams. And since I did not want to be accused of hagiography, no scholar wants to be accused of that. A member of St. Augustine's history department, however, may have noticed my discomfiture and gave me some unwanted but sagacious advice. Colin, the historian, said, make sure you don't criticize Williams in your address. This is not the time to do that. I soon learned that the audience included members of his family and also of Emeritus' family, to say nothing of the P&M supporters. I quickly removed the criticisms from the address, and I proceeded to deliberate rather nervously. The audience's response was extremely positive, especially when I said, Master Day done, but Eric Williams Day not done yet. Something which was a prophetic comment, but entirely innocently said. After the speech was over, Kamal Muhammad came up to me and said this was the best exposition on Williams that he had ever heard. A very gracious comment, but perhaps exaggerated. One of Erica's aunts said she wanted to touch my garment in appreciation. This is all true. And remember, I was this underpaid professor someplace, unaccustomed to this kind of adulation. And then Erica said she had goosebumps while I spoke. Again, much to my astonishment. But I was unprepared for what came next. When I returned to the Hilton hotel where I was staying and turned on the TV set, only to see the teaser for the evening news. It was the picture of this handsome, bald-headed man declaring that Eric Williams' Day is not done yet. I had to look at it a couple of times to figure out if I were the person they were quoting. Anyway, that began my career as a Williams scholar. It was the genesis of my book on Eric Williams and the making of the modern Caribbean. What I shall stress, however, what I want to stress, is that the book was not conceived as a biography. In fact, what I really wanted to do was to write an intellectual history of Williams, patterned after Rampersaud's intellectual biography of Du Bois. But when I began to do the research, I became more interested in the Chaguaramas issue, the Grenada issue, the warfare in Guyana, and so on. So the book examines his role, as I said earlier, on a wider Caribbean stage. But the book also, interestingly, spawned my second book on the Caribbean, this time on Cheddi Jagan and the ways in which Jagan and Burnham have named that country, and I stress the word "made." And because those two men, along with certain outsiders, the Americans and the British, have done certain things to harm the soul of Guyana, and it will take years for that nation to recover. My interest in Williams, as it developed, also spawned my interest in Jamaica, and I decided to do a trilogy, and this book, Labor and the Making of Modern Jamaica, will appear next year, and that will complete. But you see how things, none of this was planned, so I have to thank Selwyn for giving me the opportunity to deliver a speech on Williams, and eventually that enhanced my interest in the ways in which other societies, Jamaica and Guyana, have coped or not coped with the challenges of independence. Have I said enough on that? Let me go to Paul Sutton's comment on Selwyn's monumental work. And I shall simply make some very brief comments on some of the points he made. I think I'll leave the French back Creole alone. I don't know enough about that. But I don't like the reference to Williams as holding grudges. I think as a child of colonial rule, and I am one, and Carrington is one, and many of you here, it's not a question of grudges, but as you mature, you go through this process of exorcism. Is that the word? You begin to exorcise certain kinds of things into which you were socialized. So William's acerbic tongue perhaps might be perceived as a grudge, but I think it's a natural expression of a person trying to cope with his past, but at the same time rejecting that past. And you will see that in my work as well. And the older I get, and the more I do the kind of research that I'm doing, I see how all of us, from Jamaica or Trinidad or wherever, have been seriously damaged by this socialization process. I do agree that Williams's earlier works, particularly Capitalism and Slavery, constitute his best scholarship. And in fact, Capitalism and Slavery has informed his practice of the art of politics in the sense that he argues that Britain's economic development rests largely on the profits of slavery and the slave trade. And Williams would argue quite effectively, or persuasively maybe, that the Caribbean islands or countries had a claim on the British treasury. And I happen to support that. So there was that kind of interrelationship. This business of Williams having autocratic tendencies, he was a very strong guy. The jefe maximo, so to speak. But if Williams actually stood on that stage in Trinidad and Tobago as a colossus, it's because the Trinidadians allowed it. You see, even when the man was ill, people couldn't summon the courage to get him to attend to himself. He knew more than all of the other people in the cabinet combined. He thought little of the opposition in many instances. He had read more books. He had the kind of a world view that transcended the parochialism of Trinidad and Tobago or Jamaica or whatnot. And he knew that many of his associates were not his equals. And that's why he had 7 or 8 ministries. He held 7 or 8 ministries at one time. He didn't trust these other people to make intelligent decisions. And they allowed him to get away with it. You see, so it might not just be simply an expression of autocratic imperatives, but it might very well be that he dwarfed all of the other people with whom he associated. And there's no doubt, of course, that he consigned many of them to the icebox without a backward glance. And I don't want to delve into the psychology of all of this, but I've argued in the book that I wrote that Williams, as a young child, exercised enormous responsibilities over his peers, over his siblings, even chastising them and applying corporal punishment. So he lacked the kind of lubricant, so to speak, lubricating experience that one gets from a kind of egalitarian relationship with one's brothers and sisters. He was always the big boy who punished, who disciplined, who was the mentor and that sort of thing. And I think his relationship with his peers is an extension of that sort of unparalleled control that he exercised over his siblings. This is pop psychology, and I don't necessarily stand by it. I do caution my friend Selwyn to be careful about this altruistic suicide business. We don't know enough yet, and that could become the sort of superficial catch-all that people are applying to Williams in the racial business. When he talks about, when he spoke about recalcitrant minority, that has become what people refer to when they discuss race. Beg pardon? Yes, and so that could dismiss the more important aspects of your work by focusing on this particular charge, which I think merits more research and also the passage of time, because it's a very serious charge. And one, of course, if you look at the documents, one sees various people referring to him as being depressed and that sort of thing. And while I'm on this, I believe I've read, let me say this rather cautiously, all of the documents, or the majority of the documents of the PRO and in the American archives. And one of the things that comes up rather frequently is Williams's probity, in contrast to that of many of the other Caribbean leaders. And he died essentially a very poor man. And there is this one particular letter that strikes me as being significant. He goes into the country and he gets gifts from someone worth about maybe $5 TT. He comes back to his office and he writes a letter and includes what he says might be the cost of these gifts. You see, he didn't want to have his reputation tarnished. So I think, in contrast to some other folks I could name, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago appears to be a remarkably honest leader at a very difficult moment in the country's history. You can't say the same about a couple of his cabinet members, but he seems not to have been tempted to embrace venality. In 1973, I'll be done in 30 seconds. When he offered to resign in 1973, this was, as Sutton points out, a function, to some extent, of the pressure from his daughter, Erica. I know folks in Trinidad and Tobago have said that this was to smoke people out and this sort of thing, but there are 2 volumes of documents in the PRO. And he sends a letter off to Queen Elizabeth saying, I'm going to resign. I'd like your permission to resign as a member of the Privy Council. And the bureaucrats, including the Queen's Secretary, began to discuss whether this was necessary. And even the Queen entered the debate, something that shocked me. I didn't know she read all these things. And she said, doesn't Williams know that he can remain a member of the Privy Council even if he's no longer head of the government of Trinidad and Tobago? But the back and forth among the bureaucrats is very interesting. He would not have written that letter to the Queen if he were not serious about stepping down. But what I want to say to you, I'm an outsider, you know, and I like to lecture folks, that the folks, the citizens of those 2 islands, and Selwyn I include Tobago here.
Thank you.
You've got to begin to look more at the enormous talents and farsightedness that this diminutive person brought to the politics of that nation. I've studied leadership, and I'll say more about this afternoon. He stood head and shoulders above any other Caribbean leader of his time, regardless of his imperfections, and we all are imperfect in many ways. So, certainly, he stands head and shoulders of the current administration and the ones that succeeded him. While we in the Caribbean should not embrace hagiography in our assessment of people like Williams and Norman Manley, we should at least try to be balanced, as difficult as that is, to transcend narrow particularities and provide fair assessments of these individuals. This will change over time, yeah? 50 years from now, we'll have different books. Palmer's book will be updated, but at least I tried to be balanced as I wrestled with this complex human being. Thank you.
We have very few minutes for questions, but later in the afternoon there's a round table where there will be more time to fit in more questions. And again, because we had a withdrawal from the programme, there is another session where there's quite a lot of time to put questions to any of the speakers. So while we've only got a few minutes now, there will be a chance later to say something.
Selwyn, do you know where Doddridge's papers are? Have you ever seen those papers?
Some of them I have.
Yeah, but you know at which university in the United States those papers are?
I would not know. I
Well,
saw
I'll
what he
inform
had
you.
at home.
I'll inform you, you might be able to get them, I don't know. Kansas. You ever knew the middle of the United States in Kansas? Doddridge Island? Some of the papers you could see, but some of them are under permission. I think Doddridge has died since, hasn't he?
Yes, yes.
Right? So I don't know what he has done since. But those were very papers. And if you remember well, William got in the House to acknowledge that he didn't put Doddridge in the doghouse. Because Doddridge, unlike many of the others, had papers. Thank you.
Mary.
Our discussions of Williams over the last few days has kind of highlighted to me a difference between, yet another difference, between him and the other nationalist leaders who emerged in the Caribbean from the 1930s when Mandy took center stage in Jamaica.
Boston.
And the timing of Williams's return to Trinidad. In the case of Jamaica and subsequently of Guyana, the people who emerged as leaders there in the formation of the independence movement were all, of course, people who had been necessarily, in the absence of a university in the West Indies, been educated abroad. And the tendency was for them to finish their education abroad and return to their islands, territories, to go, to immediately start work in some form or another in a political capacity. Now, Williams spent some 10 years, I think, at Howard University after graduating here, and then worked with the West India Commission, so that he was kind of, there's a patch, a substantial number of years where he was not engaged in a full-time kind of way. We did hear that there were the essays and so on, pamphlets that he wrote. But I would like to know what people kind of, how one accounts for this. See, by the time he went back to Trinidad, there was already quite a sense of the small group of West Indians I knew here, of their kind of obligation to go back and do something. This was quite clear in the microscopic group I knew in Cambridge, for example, who all intended, they didn't necessarily do it, but they certainly intended to go back and make some sort of political contribution. So there's a bit of he's going kind of later into a later stage of life he's entering politics. And I wondered how you account for that.
I can't, but if you, he gets the PhD, and of course there's no university in the West Indies, so he doesn't get employed in England. He gets a job at a black institution in the United States, and there he becomes involved full-time as a scholar. He says in his writings that he avoided any involvement in American politics, although that was a particularly important moment in the evolution of African-American challenges to an unfriendly social and political system. Of course, he does have this wider interest in the Caribbean, hence his book, The Negro in the Caribbean, his desire to be a part of the commission, and all of that. So But he does not, this is one of Paul's questions, what if? What if he were not fired from the commission? Would he have been involved in politics in Trinidad? We don't know the answer to that. And by the way, Paul, I think if his second wife had not died, he probably would not have entered politics because she didn't want him to. And in some cases, people believe that this was one way of coping with her loss, with his loss, and becomes involved in the day-to-day problems of political life. So he evolves in terms of being an active participant in the political process. But he always had this intellectual interest in the direction of the West Indies. That's all I can do.
Did the Prime Minister respond?
Is there, it's not my case.
No, it's project.
Oh, okay. I have often wondered myself, what if? Because there are times when Williams talks about remaining in academia or trying to find, Dr. Garcia would know that there are times when one gets a feeling that he really preferred the academic vocation. He writes to Munoz Marin in Puerto Rico saying, I want a serious job as a researcher in the Caribbean, and could you help? And so there's this long letter which Humberto kindly sent me, which I think I referred to in the book, which indicates the possibility that Williams might have remained in academia for a considerable time later than he did. We don't know what the outcome would have been, but it's very clear. In another comment that he makes, he says something to the effect that he wanted an opportunity to be a good scholar, to get the appropriate books that he required. Juxtapose that to other kinds of evidence, because Williams comes to the Caribbean, comes to Trinidad and Tobago, meets with people like Sheldon Donaldson and others, and immediately on their request agrees to serve them as their intellectual guide, political guide, so to speak. So he links up with his teacher friends, so to speak, and assists them in creating something which eventually becomes the P&M. And even when he was outside, he always wrote constitutional drafts for people who would come to him asking for guidance. And some of these ended up as P&M's foundation documents. So we have evidence on both sides that he wanted to remain in both camps. I myself think that in time he would have gotten involved in politics. It was a matter of time. And what the tipping point was, well, we can speculate.
Yeah, one thing though, I will just interrupt, is that Williams you can't look to Williams himself for all the answers. It can't be self-evidently so what Williams says he really means. So I think that's one side of the evidence. I would point to one more thing. In the Maze of Color, Albert Gomes speaks of that, in addition to what Selwyn is saying. In the Maze of Color, Gomes takes the position when he sent out that Labour Commission that there were signs that Williams was already leaning towards the political. So in trying to understand what he would have or what if, the evidence cannot be only what Williams says of himself. There's no self-evidence here. It's what he says, but his actions and what he's doing and the testimony of others. And I want to look at what Gomes and others have said, and his actions. He came and got involved with the teachers, with helping them and working with them and so on. So his eyes were there. So I don't think we should only look to what Williams says, but look at the evidence of others and where they are portending. And I think you get a good sense that Williams' eyes, as a colonial figure, had his eyes on returning. Williams' eye, the question of when is another question, and there are all kinds of factors. But I want to look at his words.
But that letter that he writes, Humberto, I don't know if you want to support me, does not tell you that this was a man who was not serious. He was actually imploring Munoz to let him have a job there because he said, I don't want a job as an academic. I want to be a serious Caribbean scholar. So if you can't arrange that, that's okay, but he was actually seeking out consciously and deliberately an opportunity to be a leading Caribbean scholar.
Well, what you say is totally true. But the point is that he tried to get into the University College of the West Indies, and he was not allowed to get in.
Correct.
So then he moves towards Puerto Rico. And he writes in the education of the British West Indies that the University of Puerto Rico should be the model of an university against the University College of the West Indies, which was aligned to a university here. So he was looking at Puerto Rico all the time, and he was offered a position. But he didn't take it because the position was not as director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, which he proposed to be created, but a position under another American official. So I cannot imagine him going to Puerto Rico to be under Miller Hansen, who was a very strong-willed American, very conservative. It doesn't make any sense. Although they did work together in a project translating many documents of the Caribbean history from French, English, and Spanish.
Thank you. We must end it here because we've eaten into the coffee time. Can I ask that you, when you have your coffee, go grab your coffee, bring it back, because we have our panel beginning at 11:30. As I said, you will have more opportunity for more discussion, more open audience discussion in the afternoon sessions. But can we thank our very distinguished panel?